right, good morning everybody. My name is Tanya Gale and I'm a naturalist with Calvert County Natural Resources Division, and my partner here, thankfully holding my sign, is Kim Curran, another one of our naturalists. And we are coming at you this morning from the Fishing Creek, soon to be at the boardwalk in Chesapeake Beach, Maryland. And we're going to talk to you today a little bit about our oyster program. We're going to start off here with the goals for this program. So when you're going through this, we are hoping that these are some of the things that you'll be learning about oysters. All right, so number one, we want you to understand that oysters cause positive change to the environment, and that positive change is a helpful thing. So part of that, which you'll be learning about, is that oysters are filter feeders. So if you have ever made pasta, you have sort of been a filter feeder. So if you imagine you're making pasta and you've got that big dish, pot, you've got this big pot on the stove of water and pasta, and then you want to get the macaroni out of the water, what do? You're going to take that pot of water and pasta and you're going to carefully put it down through a colander, a sieve, a strainer, right? And so the water's going to go through, and that macaroni or whatever pasta you're making is going to get stuck in the strainer. And that's sort of what the oysters do. Filter feeders, they're stuck in one place. In this case, with their oysters, they are stuck down and they are pulling water into their bodies. They push it through their body across their gills, which is their filter. The food, which is phytoplankton, little teeny tiny plants that are floating around in the water, and that's their food. And then they spit the rest of the water out. So while they're doing this, they're also cleaning the water. So let me see, if you have a fish tank or a pool, there are filters on those bodies of water that you have at your house. If you have a fish tank and the filter breaks, your fish tank isn't going to look very good. It's going to happen pretty quickly because all those fish are in there doing their thing, and that filter constantly gets all the poop, gets the dirt, all the old food out of the water. And that's kind of what the oysters are doing in the Chesapeake Bay and in the rivers. So oysters cause positive change to the environment that is helpful. One way is because they're filter feeders. So as they get their food, they're also cleaning sediment and different kinds of pollution out of the water. All right, the second part of that is that oysters provide habitat for other animals. Now hopefully you remember way back when in first grade, you were talking about habitat and animals, and they have different parts where they live. And so oysters, just because of the way that they grow, I don't know that you won't be able to tell too much from this, but this is one oyster shell. Oysters are bivalves. Their shell has two parts, a top and a bottom. And when oysters are tiny, tiny babies, they're in the plankton. So they're floating around, and then they start to grow their shell and they settle to hopefully someplace good. They are looking for an oyster reef, and we'll talk a little bit more about that maybe at our spat station later on. But once oysters start to grow their shell, they attach themselves down. So they're hoping to find a place in an oyster reef. There's already lots of oysters growing there, and they attach themselves down. So I have one big oyster shell here, half of it anyway, and then you can see this funny looking thing is where another oyster was attached. And so oysters tend to live together, and so then they have all these little nooks and crannies. Doing some interpretive dance for you here, I hope you like it. They have all those nooks and crannies and spaces where small animals can come and squeeze back in there and kind of hide. So that, you guys know this, so that the big animals don't come and eat them. The small animals have to have some place to hide. So at our reef animals station, hopefully a little bit later on, you'll be able to see some of those animals who live in the oyster reef. Mud crab's a good example. There's little fish that are hiding in the oyster reef for shelter. There are other oysters other animals, that live in the oyster reef because it's a hard substrate for them to attach down onto. So if Kim here is my oyster reef and maybe I'm a tiny barnacle, I need some place to attach down onto, and that could be a good place for me. And then I'm stuck down forever, just like the oysters themselves are. Another example, we have mussels, who, just like the barnacles, they can't live on the squishy, soft mud that's on the bottom of the bay and maybe here in Fishing Creek and in the rivers. They need something hard to attach down onto. So oysters provide habitat for those animals also. So goal number 1, oysters cause change to the environment that is helpful. They're cleaning the water because they're filter feeders, and because they've got hard shells where other animals can attach, and because they grow all together, they've got all these nooks and crannies and places little animals can live there, so they're providing habitat. All right, let's move on to goal number 2. Understand that changes. You guys know all about changes. It's the perfect time, right? Things are different every single day. So we've got changes that are happening in the environment. And in this case, we're talking about changes that both are natural and might be caused by humans. Some of those changes could be overnight. They could be sudden. A big storm comes through. Or they could be gradual over 5 years or tens of years. Or those things could be positive or negative. So some of the changes that are happening in the environment, we're talking about oysters today, of course, right? So some of these changes that are happening in the environment affect oysters in a positive way. They help the oysters to grow. Maybe they make lots of food be in the water or something. The water's warmer, the oysters grow faster. So other things could be harming the oysters. So maybe we have, to go back to my example of sudden change, there's a big storm. And so that storm has lots of rain or waves from the bay, and that's going and going and going on the land, and lots of sediment, lots of dirt, then is washing into the water where the oysters live. And if you remember a minute ago, we talked about the fact that oysters can't move, right? So imagine you're an oyster, and you're out there on your oyster reef, and you can't move, you're stuck down. And then there's a big storm, and so there's lots of waves, and then maybe your creek, like Fishing Creek here, coming down across the land with all that storm water, bringing all this dirt with it. And that dirt falls on top of the oysters. Can they move? No, they can't get out of the way. So it would be like you guys sitting here, you guys are not able to move, and then we dump a big dump truck of dirt on top of you. How would that be? Would you be able to breathe? No. So oysters need to be out in the water, just like we need to be out in the open air in order for them to breathe. Some other changes that we'll talk about, or you guys might hear about other places in this oyster unit. There are diseases, MSX and dermo. Just like people get sick, animals in the wild get sick sometimes too. And so these two diseases kill oysters. They can only live a certain number of years, and then this disease, one of the diseases, kills them. So we have changes that are happening, things like sedimentation, where we have the dirt coming into the water. We have different diseases that impact the oysters. And so as we go through our unit about oysters, you'll be learning some more about those changes. I want to, before we move on, talk about caused by humans for just a second. And I would like to remind you that people don't just cause negative change. One of the things that you're going to learn about in this oyster unit is that people can do good things also. And that's important to remember. So you're going to be talking about oyster gardens. And we'll be able to see at least maybe a couple examples, hopefully, in this unit at some point. And so that's a positive change that people are making happen. That is a good thing for oysters. So we can take baby oysters, newly attached, spat, and protect them. If you remember way back when in 3rd grade you guys learned about diamondback terrapins, like head starting terrapins. So the oyster garden is kind of like head starting for oysters. You take them when they're small. Predators could easily get through this hard shell. and keeps them in some kind of cage. Sometimes those oyster gardens are floating, so it keeps them up off the bottom where all the sediment would be bad for them. And so just something to remember is that people don't always create negative change. People also do good things. All right, let's go on to goal number 3. Identify and describe features of animals and ways that they are suited to their environment. So that those features, those things that animals have on their bodies or things that they do are called, here's this word, say it with me, adaptations. Da-da-da! All right, adaptations. You may or may not have heard that word before, but you do know what it means. Okay, if you can imagine, I'm going to take us way up to the North Pole and imagine a polar bear. Maybe we're going to go to Alaska for the day. Imagine those polar bears and what color they are. Their fur is white, right? Think about where polar bears spend most of their time. There's a lot of snow there. The snow is white, and the polar bear's fur is white. So the polar bears blend in with their environment. They have this, it's called camouflage. I'm sure a lot of you have heard that word before. So oysters have not camouflaged in the same way, but they have things that help to protect them. They have these adaptations. So for example, a minute ago we talked about their shell. So an oyster's shell is an adaptation. It helps to protect them from a number of different things. So the shell, especially when they're adult oysters, is pretty thick. And most animals, most oyster predators, can't open that shell. There's a few that have their own adaptations to drill down in through the oyster drill snail. Or there's an oyster catcher, a bird that has a really thick, strong bill that can open up the oyster's shell. But most animals can't. So if an oyster is going to get eaten, it's probably going to be when it's little and its shell is pretty thin. So just that thick shell helps to protect oysters from getting eaten. It also protects them when they are, let's say, the oyster reef is kind of tall, and when the tide goes out, the oysters are up in the air, exposed. Remember, these are water animals, right? So they are exposed up in the air. There's other birds, other raccoons, predators that could come eat them. They can't eat and they can't breathe, except that they have this shell that closes up really tight, keeps a little bit of water inside there so that they don't dry out. Yes, they can't eat when they're up in the air, but that's part of why when we go to our spat station, you'll see that we keep our baby oysters, these spat, up out of the water for hours sometimes. And that's okay for the oysters because they can close up their shell all tight and just kind of hide inside there until they get back into the water. All right, let's take a look at goal number 4. So this is the big question for this program. We're going to be looking at Fishing Creek and figuring out if this would be a good place for oysters. So understand what conditions oysters need to survive. That's the first part. And we're going to take a look at our board just in a second, which has a list of those conditions that we're going to be testing during this program. And then we're going to assess. You guys know a lot more about this word than most adults do. Assessments are tests. So we're going to be going through some tests for you, and you're going to take a look at those and decide how the conditions are at Fishing Creek. So the last part, determine if this location, the Fishing Creek Boardwalk, would be a suitable site for an oyster garden project. So if you remember a minute ago, we were talking about oyster gardens. That's something that, depending on where you live, people could have this oyster garden. It doesn't have to be very big. There's lots of different kinds. And if the conditions at the site are correct, you could have an oyster garden, and that would be something that would create positive change, help to protect the baby oysters, and then you would also be creating habitat for other animals at the same time. All right, let's take a quick look at our physical conditions board.